So welcome to this session of the IIEP Strategic Debates. Welcome to everybody, to our speakers. Welcome to all the people who sit in this room. And also welcome to the audience online. I know we have a number of people online from Brazil to Pakistan and many other countries, so welcome to you. Just for those people who particularly, you know that you can intervene and react, ask questions or make comments on Twitter at hashtag strategic debates, and also on YouTube. So please don't hesitate to intervene, and we'll kind of pick or select a few questions for our speakers. IIEP Strategic Debates is a discussion forum that addresses the issue of educational planning, decision making, and management. So regularly, IIEP invites high-level professional and academics to come and discuss with us, the staff IIEP, different audience, and also the trainees to discuss with us some various topics on this issue, and present their results of their finding and their experience to exchange with us. Each year we choose a different overarching theme. So this year the theme is about equitable education system, which is fully in line, of course, was with SDG 4 on equitable and quality education for all. This particular debate is the 5th of the series on equitable education system. We already, if you remember, we invited Andreas Fleischer from OECD to talk about PISA results. We had in May Pierre Mathieu, former director of Sciences Po Lille, on accessing higher education. We also invited Pauline Rose from Oxford University on the impact of inequalities on learning achievements. And last debate was with Frank Adamson from Stanford University on public and private investment in education. I really don't want to be too long for this short introduction. So once again, thank you for being here, whether in the room or online. And I will leave the floor to my colleague, Michaela Martin, who is in charge of IIEP Strategic Debates, to introduce the topic of today and also our speakers. Thank you. Michaela, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hugo, for this warm welcome on behalf of IIEP leadership. I think we have a very interesting topic today. How does private schooling private schooling growth affect the public system and the educational quality and equity? Research evidence from Nepal. So we all know that private schooling is a growing phenomenon in most countries worldwide. And according to World Bank data, the data was provided by Priya, the private market share in primary education in low-income countries has nearly doubled from 12% in 1990 to 22% in 2010. And there's a long-standing debate among policymakers and in the academic community on the effects on the growing share of private schooling in general and on the public school system in particular. And the positions are often very ideological. For the neoliberals, the private sector, through the stimulation of competition, will boost the quality of schooling. And for the more leftists, it will lead to an erosion and then the takeover of the public system and the capacity of the state to provide the public good. Therefore, I think it's very good that we have more research evidence and that we look at the question at the country level, where we can also study it in the context of the particular circumstances of the country. And so I'm very happy that I can present today our two speakers. So we have Priyadarshani Joshi. She is research officer at the Global Education Monitoring Report of UNESCO. She has an academic and professional background in education, public policy, and economics, and she holds a PhD, and she will present the results, by the way, of her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and a master's in public administration from Princeton University. Her personal research agenda focuses on the consequences of private sector growth for the public sector, parental choice, and system-wide quality and equity, building on her doctoral research in her home country of Nepal. Her work has been published in several key journals focused on international education issues. And then we have with us also Claire Galante-Moratti. She is chargée de mission at the Agence Française de Développement. She holds a master's degree in education sciences. She worked for 2 years in NGOs on education and citizenship issues with vulnerable groups in post-crisis situations in Afghanistan, Kosovo, and Haiti. She joined IFD in 2011 as project officer in charge of the Bujumbura office in Burundi, and then served as regional geographic coordinator for the Palestinian territories in Jordan in 2013. And with the Education Division, Training and Employment since 2014, she works now in Niger, Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ecuador. So we have on the one hand the researcher, and we have also the practitioner from a development agency intervening in educational development projects. And I think that was what we tried to bring together as points of views and perspectives for this strategic debate. So we are going to have some 45 minutes of presentation by Priya, and then we will have some 10 to 15 minutes of comments by Claire, and then the floor will be open for discussions with our audience here, but then also more broadly with the audience of our streaming facility. And then we are going to have a cocktail for those who have the time to remain with us. So, Priya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michaela. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. I'm really thankful to Sue Grant-Lewis and Michaela for inviting me for this strategic debate, and to Claire Galante for being a discussant. You can see the presentation titled, How Does Private Schooling Growth Affect the Public System and Educational Equity? As Michaela has mentioned, it's based on my dissertation work, which I did in Nepal. To just start with, as a refresher, not that people in this room need a reminder on this. You imagine, that there's a public school in a community, and typically funded by an education bureaucracy through taxes of some sort, and it has and that it has a monopoly because it is the only school in the district, so everyone has to go to that school. And in this, you enter, a private school enters this mix. Maybe it's monitored by private school associations, etc. The fundamental idea is that just by virtue of the fact that there's something else out there, that students and parents now have choice, and then teachers and principals and the rest of the bureaucracy and others have to compete so that they can get enrollment. So I asked 3 research questions in this project. The first dealt with parents. How and why do parents select schools if there is any selection? How do they continue to engage with them after choosing schools? The second dealt with the public sector. What is the public sector's experience of and response to private competition? And the third, more briefly, deals with the private sector perspective. So how do private school actors view their role in the education system? I was motivated to look at this topic because it is the ideas of choice and growth and competition are a global trend and an academic focus around the world. Really, you have U.S. charter schools and homeschooling. You have vouchers. The most famous of which is the Chilean system. You have private schools around the world. And actually, from the time that I did this work, this debate has only picked up steam. There's the private schools for the poor debate, and only recently we had at IIEP you had a discussion on the public versus private investment model for education. So really global as issues go. I became interested in 2 research gaps, so to speak. One was the first point was on process. In developing countries, there's a documented lack of focus on analyzing the process through which schooling decisions are made and how households interact with schools once they make that choice. And secondly, I was also interested in focusing on what is happening at the local level, because a lot of the competition analysis, because it focuses on the link between competition measures and learning outcomes, did not have as much understanding of process. This is mostly based on the US context, but there was a feeling that we need a better understanding of local education markets to understand how competition is experienced and whether there is actually any choice. So the debate really, as Michaela mentioned, there are ideological sides, but there's also a lot of this, pro and con. You can have a debate with people on both sides. I try to sort of think of this as it's one pot. You can't really have be on one side on this issue. On the parental choice issue, the idea is that parents can better match children to the schools of their preference, and as a result, they will be more engaged and satisfied. But the flip side is always, that there can be sorting by income and ability. There was a pretty nice book on this, which was titled "Who Chooses, Who Loses," which I think pretty much covers the point. On the public school side, again, the idea is that competition will be a pressure that motivates improvement efforts. There are a lot of people who think it's inappropriate to view education as a market. And then there are the people who sort of study the implementation of these, the implementation and the field and on the ground efforts to basically conclude that it's very difficult to incentivize reforms when there are such systematic barriers. On the private school side, I think the general idea is that they have to survive. They have to respond to parental demands to survive, so they will provide some sort of good quality. On the negative, the challenge is that many people think that this sort of promotion of private schooling will shift the focus from the public good aspect of education, and also, of course, that private schools can then turn their attention towards getting them more desirable. So that if the emphasis is so much on outcomes, which is something that did happen in Chile to quite a large extent. So that is the sort of research motivation. Now I turn to what I did and where I did this. This map shows the field sites of my primary data collection. I chose 2 districts that are Kathmandu, the capital city, and Chitwan, which is a highly diverse district with which is sort of medium-sized. And both of these districts have a substantial private schooling presence, which was important for to have these questions on, does competition lead to anything? And I did my analysis also on these. I also visited 5 other districts to understand the variation in context and whether the findings I was finding in these districts was translating to these other contexts. If you look at this, I collected a lot of data. If you look at this tree analogy, everything, the trunk and above are the quantitative data, the roots are the qualitative data, the blue are the primary sources of data collection, and the red are the secondary sources. There were a lot of secondary sources of data, but in the end, I ended up doing primarily using them for background purposes. In the 2 districts in blue that go up and down the trunk, I collected a census of principal surveys, and I did parent focus groups and parent surveys, and I also collected district records on private schooling. So coming to country context, Nepal is characterized by a lot of unfortunate characteristics. It's low income, it has highly difficult terrain, it has high ethno-linguistic diversity, a very deep-rooted history of oppression and marginalization has led to a very prolonged political instability. The prolonged political instability has led to a very significant migration, brain drain, etc. in this country. In my country, system side, private schooling growth has been fueled by both demand and the ease with which you can expand schools. There have been several public education reforms, mostly targeted at management and financing. If you just look at the data, it is very clear that there is a 2-tiered system that's developing. From the left, you see that private market shares are much higher in urban areas, but they're also actually growing a little bit in rural areas. A lot of this demand for private schooling is based on the only outcome measure that people are very accustomed to measuring and seeing publicized, which is the student pass rates and student distinction rates, etc., in the high stakes examination. And the second figure basically shows that private schools have been better at passing students from the high stakes exam over the decades. But the third figure basically shows that there's also a steady growth of concentration of disadvantage in the public schools. You have people who are Dalit, so lower caste, and while they made up 6% of the enrollment in private schools, they made up 21% of the enrollment in public schools in 2010. So, and you have a situation like this, a very volatile political context. There are issues that plague both the public and the private system. This newspaper clipping from, again, 2011-12 shows two stories. One where public schools had to be displaced due to a lack of students, but on the other hand, there were protests in private schools because they dared to raise school fees. So that was the background that I went into it with. Now to start the analysis portion, as I mentioned, and to start with parents, 2 questions: how do they select schools, and what do they do after they've selected the schools? So this was the framing of the process, and just to take you around it, the basic argument is that you first, as a parent, you first have to decide what you want in a school. Then you have to inform yourself about through your informal and formal networks about what's available. Then you have to consider options. Then you have to send your child to that school. So that's sort of the first part of the story. And then once you've sent that child to the school, maybe you interact with the school, maybe you interact with the child to understand whether you're satisfied with the school or not. Maybe if you're dissatisfied, you voice your concerns and communicate them, and the school sort of responds, and then you're satisfied enough and you stick with the school. Or maybe you're not satisfied and then you exit or consider changing the school, that is. And if you do exit, then I guess you repeat the process armed with new and old information. And this is based on a lot of research on parental decision making. And I investigated sort of all of these in detail, but I wanted to just highlight a few points here. In terms of school selection, there is a real big issue on money with regards to the money people have and the children's interest as determining school selection. There is no real proper information system, objective information system. So people decide through informal networks, through local knowledge, and through child interest. But this is not that surprising. This is how decisions are made. When I look at sort of data on the why, a lot of it is linked to your practical issues, such as it has to be close to home. In a very volatile political situation in Nepal, the proximity to home was actually really important, even for the wealthiest of people, because you could be traveling by bus, and then you could be called to pick up your kid in the middle of the road, and these things that made the transportation issue not just an expense, but actually so that meant that being close to home was important for the rich as well as the poor. And they did think that academic quality, generically defined, was important, and English medium was important, and of course how affordable it was for them. I draw your attention to the fact that for public school parents, the fact that it was relatively cheap was pretty much a dominant reason for choosing that school. On the other side, it surprised me when I found this, but I don't know. Now that I think about it, it's quite intuitive that children do have a major role in decision making. I think I was surprised by it because in the sort of grand literature on these issues, we've been led to think that it's about the parents and the schools and the parents and the schools. So the fact that children are quite important in this decision making was a very recurrent thing. But especially with parents like this woman who said in a focus group that I had no idea about the school. She as and her daughter said, I will go to the school. She gave her the fees. The next day she came back and said, well, they need a mother or a father to come and admit the person to the school. And so the next day I went to the school and admitted her there. So, and that was the extent of her involvement in the decision. And if you break it down by education level and private and public, you see that the importance of that child role in decision making is quite significant for people who have lower education, and a little bit more significant for people who have chosen or gone to public schools. So now to turn to the issue of what happens once they're in that school. I had chosen a diverse set of schools in my 6 locations, so these are about 30 schools. And so there were a diversity of public and private schools. So simply speaking, I had divided my sample when I was analyzing it into two, like better public, better private, worse public, worse private. Actually not worse, but smaller private. And all the survey and qualitative data show that in these smaller private schools, the parents appear to be most engaged and empowered. What this means is that they believe that that the principals and the team is accountable to them, and they can go to them for answers and they will respond to them. For the well-known private schools, the ones that were in high demand, there was much less engagement, and I think this is maybe just logically because the wealthier the schools have more power in the school parent dynamic there. For the average and above public schools, there was a bit of a dissatisfaction on English education. English education is very much a private school quality, so that's not too private school characteristic, so that's not too surprising. And also on some disciplinary aspects. What is, I guess, the most of concern is that for the below average public schools, where about 4 or 5 of them in my sampling, the schools themselves were not gauging parental satisfaction. In one of the parents groups, the parents basically said that this was the first time they had met in the school. So the schools are not doing that part of the role, but parents are also not communicating this dissatisfaction. And some of it was as simple as as you may be able to predict, they don't have the time to come, and they are daily wage laborers. They don't have the time to come for parent meetings. So you have a situation where obviously whatever choice may exist in the system, poor parents are not benefiting from it. So I would really classify the parent decision-making storyline as one of a stratified society. And if we now turn to what's happening in the public sector, as I mentioned, I looked at, are they experiencing competition? Are they doing something about it? And what affects what they're doing? Broadly speaking. So again, in terms of the framing, it was a fairly simple argument that most of the times you have to experience it. You have to feel the need to do something, which was the first part, and then maybe you do something. So responses are policy changes that the school might adopt, and then maybe eventually at some level you will have an outcome change. And of course, what you do and how you feel about doing something is affected by the motivations and constraints you face. So if you think back to that earlier slide that I presented, it really is about locally things are very specific, and they can be quite different based on context. If you take any situation of a local context, a lot of people actually think that when they think of competition, they think of, well, are there many private schools around you? Are you really feeling that pressure? But that's not enough. Often what we find is that a lot depends on whether there are financial consequences for losing enrollment, whether the schools are actually losing enrollment, etc. The actual sort of competitive burden has to be felt. And finally, of course, it is that the people determine the decisions, especially if you have enough autonomy to make decisions. The people who are in charge determine what happens. So are they perceiving that competition? And a lot of my colleagues who work on the US with far more sophisticated data and who are involved in defining these measures, they've been pointing out the loopholes. They've been pointing out how difficult it is to come up with this, significant concrete definitions. Because of all this difficulty, I decided that I'd use both what I considered quote unquote objective definitions, and I created a subjective definition. Objective definitions include things like asking a principal how many private schools are near you, which is something I asked, and the percentage private enrollment in the locality, which I calculated from the administrative records. The subjective definition was something that I developed just by asking, who are you competing with? And I asked principals to name 3 schools. And then I transformed this into a dummy variable, which was 1 if you named at least one private school. So I perceive them to be competing if you consider private schools as one of your top 3 competitors. So again, with the numbers, to feel the competitive experience, there should be some private school growth. Is there private school growth? from the data that I gathered, we can say yes, there are more private schools, and these are just secondary level schools. And especially since the 90s, they have the number of private schools has grown significantly, especially in the capital district, where they basically dominate the market now. So there are more private schools. And as I mentioned earlier, well, are they really feeling any enrollment pressures? It's all fine and well if you continue to have the student body to keep your school maintained. There is a little bit of, this is not as robust, so it needs a bit more analysis, but the descriptive data show that that in private schools there's sort of stabilizing, there's sort of a stable enrollment level, but with public schools there's a bit of a decline in the enrollment levels. So my argument was that they have the conditions to sort of need to respond, at least from a quantitative standpoint. And so are they doing anything? And in one of my papers, I looked at a wide range of instructional and non-instructional policies. I labeled some of them as private mirroring. Basically, what is attractive about private schools, can we mirror it? One of the big ones is English medium of instruction. And this is not just a Nepal phenomenon, it's a phenomenon in many Anglophone countries. In India, this is a big deal that, this is the distinguishing factor. So I asked the public school principals whether they had adopted this, and 3/4 of them had started some English medium of instruction. This is 2011-12. Another thing that distinguishes public from private school children is the way they look. So I asked them if they had added, ties and belts to their uniforms, because almost everyone had uniforms, and that is also something that 2/3 of public schools say that they now require. And then I switched to instructional, quality of education sort of strategies, because a lot of the issues were, you can imagine that if you improved your outcomes, then you could be competing, healthily competing with the private school. If you look at instructional time strategies, and exam coaching is a big one. Almost all of the schools say they do some sort of exam coaching for the 10th grade, the big exam that everyone sort of waits for, and that is sort of how you get to higher education. But less than half had specific, targeted coaching for weaker students. And I think more tellingly, about 1/3 only had some sort of remediated classes for weaker students, like across the board. So just to take you through one example of the one of adopting English medium. It is a very important one because parents are demanding it. It is what they think is it is one of the main things that they think distinguishes private schools from public schools. And public school principals say that yes, the idea is to stem the outflow of any students by providing English medium. If you look at the year that they transitioned to English medium, you see that it's a fairly rapid but recent adoption of English medium. So in some schools, all of the 10 grades are in English. In some schools, they're just 1 or 2, and in Kathmandu, a lot of them were actually fairly recent. And actually, in the qualitative data, you hear that some people started and then they realized they can't really do it, so they switch back to Nepali. So there's a lot going on, of course, at the school level. And I guess a linked question is: does it matter? Does it depend on how much competition you face? I did some regressions here. The only thing I wanted you to take from this is that perception measure that I was telling you about. It does seem to be that if you think that if you say that you are competing with a private school, you are more likely to have adopted English medium of instruction. And it is a causal analysis. It's a correlation analysis. There's no causality here. All I want to say with this is that these sorts of measures, I think, may be better able to capture these subjective, aspects that we are not able to capture with, just numbers of private schools around. So that is the paper, and I look forward to your comments if you are able to read this. Now turning to the question of enabling environments, which I call necessary conditions for productive responses to competition here. You imagine like a school needs community support. It needs, an able leader. It needs a qualified team. It needs resources beyond whatever is needed for regular functioning, and it needs bureaucratic support. In Nepal, that is bureaucratic. There's a bureaucratic system that at the district level and then at a local level. On the flip side, you have constraints. You can start from disadvantage. If you start from disadvantage, if you lack community support, there's very few members of the community go to your school. If you don't have any supplementary revenue to do anything, and if you lack that bureaucratic support, and no matter how hard you try, you can't really adopt policies like English medium or any other policies that you may deem are more appropriate for quality. Really, you just can't really go there. And something that is not discussed in the same framing, but I put it in the same framing, is things like the very strong political influence in the education system as also a major constraint in these reform efforts, and also linked to actually the public-private issue. So political instability is not something that is just tied to competition. I mean, it affects the country, and of course it affects public sector functioning. What we hear a lot about and there's a lot of literature out there on the teacher-politician link. That teachers are really are used for the political system, and thus they don't come to school. There's no sort of accountability around that. And I heard my fair share of that discussion about that. A lot of the blame can be put on the teacher-politician link. But I would say that the predominant discussion was on the fact of how politics was pervasive in society. And really, this, I think, quote from a deputy director captures it, is this idea that everyone is divided. So all teachers are divided, school management committees are divided, and so is society. So, this idea that when you're introducing your child, they're asked whose child they are and which party they belong to. So that, I think, captures the essence of, how pervasive it is. So, I mean, let's not go, we don't have to go through all of this in this framing, but I think of it as very much a core defining political instability as a core factor that determines, what's happening to policies, because policies are politicized. So a lot of, good reforms are not really, happening or not being implemented or not having the desired effects. There's indifference due to transitional politics. I think there were 27 prime ministers in Nepal since 1990. So you can just imagine the churning in the system. So it worsens bureaucratic functioning because it's just unstable. No one really, there's no stability in the system. And both of those things sort of add up to a worsened impression of public governance. I mean, just the public system as well as public schooling. And because of political instability, at least in Nepal, there was significant migration. It's become one of the highest, it is, I think, the number 3 remittance to GDP ratio in the world, I think. So it's significantly dependent on remittances, which also means, and with globalization and reduced fertility over time, private schooling has become more affordable. So all of these, political instability link factors then lead to this worsening gap between public and private schools. And it comes out kind of interestingly in some of my discussions that people view there to be separate roles for public and private schooling. And it came out in the school management committee discussion where they basically said, really everyone who is important, their children go to private school, which means that whatever the education-related attention is, it's focused on those schools. So the government community school, these are his words, has become a place to play politics and get some additional respect. So it is a place where you get respect, but it is not your purpose to go there to improve the quality of education. And I posed some quite controversial statements. I would say to the principals in my sample. I asked, are there more politically appointed teachers who are not concerned with teaching in public schools? And 2/3 of them agreed to the statement. Maybe an even more controversial thing was, most of the parents of public school students do not understand the importance of education, and also 60% agreed to this. This is among, many other kinds of questions I posed to them, but this, represents the politics and community support issues that I was pointing out. And finally, when you just look at whether it varies by, the number of private schools you're surrounded by, it is true that the principals of public schools who are in locations with more private schools, they have a higher likelihood to agreeing to these challenges. So, they might be faced with a different kind of student body. They might be faced with a different kind of parents also, although this really needs a bit more work. So again, I would say if I were to summarize what I find from the public system, Lots of challenges, some interesting efforts at competition, but primarily a story of challenges. When I think of when we look at the private sector perspectives, there's I tried to collect some data to have like a general characterization of what's happening in the country, but more specifically, what are the characteristics? What do they think they provide to the system, and what do they think the government needs to do for private schooling as a system? So this is primarily based on 2 districts. So the big district, in the capital, you see that there are a wide variety of schools, but there are also cheap, medium, and medium expense and extremely expensive schools. If you look at this by the decade these schools were established, you see that the more recent ones are a bit cheaper, and this just might be linked to some sort of longevity premium for the older schools. So in many ways, this behaves more like a market. It's a more market-like system. Chitwan district, a much smaller district. You see that there are narrower fee bands, so it's not like you have extremely expensive schools or extremely cheap, and there are a few cheap schools. And it doesn't really depend that much by the decade at which they were established as well. So, the private school fees are lower and they're more controlled. And, of course, the question is, why is this the case? And a lot of the anecdotal discussion was that it's because the district is smaller in size, the parents are much more able to investigate what's happening in the schools. Like, if they could sort of take a walk and they can find out what's happening in the 10 private schools in their neighborhood. In Kathmandu, you can have 20, 30, 40. I mean, you're just overwhelmed. It's not like you are going to go and assess the situation everywhere. So that's the parent side of it, and then systematically also they had a lot of regulations in place at the district level. So why were the schools started? Most of the founders and they were mostly founders, basically stated both things. It was for employment. A lot of them were contract teachers. They wanted stable employment. Some refer to it as clean investment, a way to make white money. In a country that's starved for real investment opportunities. It's simple. It's not like it takes a lot of money. And social motivations. Give back to the community, quality education, etc. How is also interesting. Most of them got together in a group because, again, this is a sort of a logical decision. You don't have that much capital to fund a school. So in one school, there were 53 shareholders. In Kathmandu district, because it's such a big district, it functions more like a market also in terms of, you have regular handovers of schools. So maybe a team comes by, they can't make a profit after a couple of years, they leave, they've already gotten permission to run the school, another person and another team comes and takes over ownership. And from the data I collected, there were 150 requests for ownership changes in a 2-year period. So I think the market is about 1,000 schools. So it's a fairly substantial number of turnover. On the question of who attends these schools, I mean, this needs much better data. We know, of course, that the wealthier go to private schools. More generally speaking, based on living standard surveys data. But it is the reality that it is a heterogeneous group. Most do not have the option to sort a lot of students, especially in these districts. There's too much competition, and there are too few children to be sorting a lot. But of course, there's self-selection. The people who can pay are the ones who make themselves available. And on the question of why are they considered better? I would say that it's frankly, most do not think they're that much better. They just think that public schools are really bad. So a common thing I heard was, well, if they just reach some minimal level, you wouldn't really have to try to intervene and close the private schools. They would just shut down because who would come to private schools if you can go to a better functioning public school? But there were some definitely who said that it isn't one thing. It's based on their experiences, the quality of education provided, the care provided, in early childhood and at other levels, the level of teacher effort, and of course, the always the high stakes exam performance. So there's a combination of factors that are actually better in private schools. And there are many, many grievances against the government system. Part of it was so the basic demand, they find them to be quite hostile and quite anti-private. So that was quite interesting. They want them to view private schooling positively, recognize the contributions they've made to national development. Simply, because the government system did not expand enough, they are shouldering a lot of the burden in the system. They want them to support private schools. There are many struggling schools that just need a little bit of investment. Interestingly, all of them basically said, monitor us. The government should be monitoring us. And they want a bigger private role, whether it be, with sort of knowledge exchanges, etc., kind of discussions. So yeah, increased communication, reduce hostility was a very common theme. And then another one was about developing a separate private education act, because I'm not sure if you're aware, but in the conflict period, there was a big in Nepal, there was a big call to ban all private schools. So the sector does not feel very stable. Like any day there can be like a political revolt, and there can be a ban. And the final thing they mentioned was we're not companies, we're educational institutions. We should be registered as such, because that's what we're providing. So at the end of all this, there was a very strong narrative coming out that public is doing so much worse than private. Struggles of public, etc. So I tried to look at this question, so just to see if it would give me any innovative insights that were different, that might be more hopeful. So the question really was about best schools, and how can one identify great schools and what makes them special. So quality is a very difficult thing to define. Where I work, the GMR, and the GEM report now, we've tried it many times. There's a lot of thinking around this issue. What I tried to do was circumvent this whole discussion on quality and basically base it on peer opinions again. So there was a survey question that was asked to all of these principals, because you remember it's a census of all public schools. So which are the best public schools, which are the best schools in the district, and name 3 schools. So you could name up to 3 schools. And all I did was, map the linkages. So, and these are only the secondary schools, because I also had these are only public schools. I also had private schools in the sample, but they're not here because otherwise it wouldn't be a closed network. And the only thing I really want you to take from this is that there were 212 public schools in the sample. 56 were identified by one other school as a great school, as a best school. And very, very few schools are cited very frequently by the whole district. So in Kathmandu, there were 3 schools that were cited, much more than the others. And in Chitwan, there were 2. So, again, and school A and B, school B in Kathmandu and school A in Chitwan happened to be in my local, my more detailed analysis. So what differentiates public schools, the best ones? Those 5, most cited schools have much better examination performance, and perhaps as a result, they're in much greater demand. They have high enrollment rates, higher fees, the more quantitative numbers that I guess are sort of expected. They also have a very strong reputation, like throughout the community. What I found interesting was that a fairly expensive private school in a locality said, we consider school B to be the guardian of all the schools in this locality, and we learn from them. So they actually go to that school and learn from their practices and, share it within the system. And there were a lot of discussions on within school functioning. A lot of what you might expect, that they were they both improved tremendously over 20 years, and they started by targeting student performance. They don't have performance pay systems, so they try to motivate by leading by example. They have a fairly substantial student role built in monitoring and providing suggestions, and they try to only involve parents in helping motivate students. And they also feel the weight of their responsibilities, at least these 2 principals. They think that it's not just enough for them to improve, but like one school improving is not enough. We need 10, 20 to do better so that all children come back to public schools. And they think of this as a confidence building measure. So it's a very difficult thing to answer again what works. I wanted to put out these 2 quotes here. From these 2 principals. The first one is about how he deals with politics. He told me what party he belonged to. He told me his whole history of how he was treated because of the party he was from. And he said, it's not everyone knows what party he belongs to. He just doesn't advertise it or promote it. And the whole teaching team contains people of all political affiliations. And the reason it functions is because there is no bias in the classroom setting, and he's very aware of that. Like he's aware of not letting that bias be felt. The second thing was something that came up quite a bit as well, that and school A, I would say, was more anti-private. All three of this principal's children had finished their education in the school itself. He said that he cannot send them to private schools. It's not that he doesn't have the money to do it. It's just that he has the confidence that his public school can deliver and the children can make their own progress. So these, I think, really represent this, the only transformative solutions you can have to deal with political issues as well as a lack of, community support. So, in the end, there was a challenge of the social prestige, even in these best public schools. And this one principal basically said, let me do a scientific study. So why is it not attractive to parents, despite our track record and reputation? He surveyed 100 local guardians and got 3 points of feedback. The first one is about English medium. The second basically is students of the school are children who wash dishes in other people's homes, and we fear that they would spoil by being in bad company. And the third school is a government school. The fear was that their social status would fall. So again, 1 point on English medium, 2 on social status. They couldn't do anything about social status. They adopted English medium as a result of this scientific study. So that is those are the findings, and I will now turn to conclusions for the case as well as more broadly. Circling back, what are the implications? Are parents satisfied and more engaged? Yes, I would say they are, but it's very much a more middle class story. And is there sorting? Of course there is. It's a relatively pretty much an unregulated choice system. Everything is based on financial capacity and social capital. Obviously, a very highly stratified system. Are public schools facing pressures and responding? And you see a little bit of this recent focus. You saw that even English medium is a 5 to 10 year thing that they've started. And I think primarily due to extreme enrollment pressures, negative publicity, like the pressures that are coming up now in these more high private market share districts that are also the wealthier districts, actually. But it's true, that it is very difficult to incentivize reform and politics, and loss of community support in societies like this have propelled the public-private divide. Are private schools more responsive? Yes, I would say that the data on both the parents as well as the principals do suggest that they are responsive to parental demands, and they provide better test scores than English medium. On the question of whether they're focusing on getting the most desirable, I think it's difficult to say because at least again, a super heterogeneous group. Not all private schools are super selective; they can't be, but there is, of course, a little bit of a concern that there's sorting and there's some profit motive concern. Although I don't think it's throughout the system. And I guess the main thing that came out of that discussion was that private schools need government attention, and more collaboration, in whatever form. To turn to more of a policy discussion, when you do a data-based dissertation like this, I think the first thing you think of is where's the data? Can you make it can you simplify it, the access to that data? So there's a lot of possibility to integrate what exists for better research use. But there's also a lot of scope for new data, especially given the kinds of questions I was thinking about. At least even if it's not regularly monitored, and even if not annual, regularly monitored, because you need to know what's happening at your school level if you've given them this level of autonomy. There's also not that much good information on finance and SES, parental SES, because these sorts of questions are going to, I think, affect a system like this, which remains highly unregulated. So they all need to be matched well and integrated. I didn't speak about this much today, but there's a lot that can be done with the local level personnel, and there's not going to be a massive expansion of the local level personnel, so there has to be a productive use of them. There are many reasons to improve teacher distribution and financing equity, and I think a lot has been tried, but much more needs to be done if the idea is that schools are supposed to actually compete and improve. An interesting thing was a local level official said that in one of the schools that he went to, there were 5 students and 8 teachers, and 4 of the teachers were absent, and the principal wasn't there. actually, 4 of the teachers who were there were incredibly frustrated, and they didn't really want to be there. They were, so they had a long conversation, and he said, well, they recommended that the school be closed, the teachers be shifted to the nearby school, and he gave this as an example to state that there's not a lot of resentment from the teachers because they want to do their job and teach a decent number of students. And even if the political class is very resistant to this, I mean, how long can they keep resisting this sort of change? So I feel like there's some egregious situations which add to the disrepute of the public system, and some of that I think can be improved. So even if and the wide sweeping changes, we're speaking very generally here, but there are specific changes probably that could be made. And again, I can't give you a very simplistic answer on this, like what can and has worked. It's true, there are tremendous challenges. This private school principal, talking about the public system, said, the plant is dry, it's not dead yet, but it has nothing. The leaves have fallen, you cannot give it much water or fertilizer. You have to protect it from sun and water damage and slowly improve its situation so that new leaves emerge again. And so, what is this? What are the things that you can do to this nearly dead plant so that it recovers? And I speak from what the people who are improving the situation said that they were doing. Part of it is this whole business of recruiting effective principals and it's not just about content expertise, but people who can navigate the system, who can motivate teachers, minimize political activity. One of the principals suggested that he has done this before himself, but more of in an informal basis. Sort of partnering with other schools that need help and thus, helping them improve through some sort of, I guess, management training, so to speak. And I think this kind of discussion has been around for, public-private partnerships quite a bit. But I think that this sort of within public sector thing might be more desirable and actually more feasible, at least in this context. And the second thing is there is a need to fight the perception battle because I think the stigma issue is now getting to be different from just the outcome issue. It's a controversial thing to suggest, but it is true that at least there were some examples where once the teachers and principals started sending their children to the public schools where they taught, there were transformations in those schools. And I guess the final thing is collaboration as a focus instead of competition or playing the blame game. In a district that had a very smooth functioning, he said that politicians are not just interference. They're also, politicians and student groups are not just interference. They also can be strategic partners. And I think that sort of point also, translates to how the private sector could be viewed in this case. They're just not competitors. So closer to the end, what are the global implications? Can it make a positive difference? Can private growth make a positive difference? I think yes, because private expansion did increase opportunities for the middle and the lower middle classes here. Part of it was to choose schools, and feel like you were part of that community again. And it can't be denied that over 20 years it's generated employment and contributed to society. So there's that window of it has sort of expanded opportunities for when the state did not expand itself. But obviously it has tremendous effects on equity when you sort of let that continue. This is a finding consistent from Chile is a glaring example, but almost every country where people have studied these sorts of reforms, you find it to be the case that equity is what's affected. Now going back to the question that motivated my thinking on this, can the public sector benefit at all from growth? I encountered a situation in Kathmandu which was pretty much close to stigma of public schooling, and in Chitwan, which was sort of, I would say, middle ground, because about half were going to public and private schools. So I feel like there is a timing component to this. Like when do you sort of really incentivize public schools to compete with private schools? You can't really ask them to transform after a long-term decay when generations of the community have sort of just stopped going to public schools. So there's a little bit of that. And I think the second point really is that any public-private partnership, and I say this not just about Nepal, but more generally, it requires strong government commitment if it's going to work. And clearly the private school is not really that engaged with the government authorities. And, so the collaborations are important, both I would say, within the system, within the public system, and with the private system. This is slightly outdated, but when I was doing this research, I was also thinking about, is it globally relevant at all? And I've always thought that this was globally relevant because it's a question of what happens to the public system as a result of the private system. But if you do more of this, if you do like a sort of a mapping of this commonalities, Nepal, it is of course relevant for South Asia, but if you look at the fact that there are so many countries that are low and lower middle income, countries that have substantial private share, landlocked or fragile fragile political climate countries, there's at least 20 odd countries where this is, I think, a good research possibility. And I mean, I guess to end this, there's so many things that we could discuss in the debate to go forward. Decentralization, political conflict, there's so many things. I just wanted to pose one point about what is important for the global community to think about is this question of, should the global community invest in for-profit chains that aim to provide private schools for the poor? And it's a very complicated thing to answer. It depends on country decision making, and I just want to say that from my own collective understanding, that locally grown solutions are important, and they do exist. Once you go in depth, you see that people are trying different kinds of things, and whether they be public or private, I would even argue. And so locally grown solutions are important, and even more especially so in unequal societies, if education is ever going to have an ameliorating effect on inequality. So that is the presentation. I thank my research team, my committee, my funders, my family. These are the papers. If you are interested in the work itself, the title is my website. And thank you so much. This is the database decision making we do in Nepal, I guess.
Yeah, thank you, Priya. I think you have taken us through a wonderful journey from the very local to the very global. So we have made a lot of ground, and I think you have presented a lot of data, and that's one of the main conclusions that I take from your presentation. There are, of course, many of these, but one of it is, well, if you have a growing private sector, it affects the public schooling, but not necessarily in the way of improved quality. At least that was not something that you could substantiate, but more from the point of view of having mirroring strategies and trying to make sure that you have those emblema in place that make you seen as competitive. So I think that's something interesting to take from your study immediately. But I'm sure that Claire has much more interrogations and many more experiences to share from her own experience working with countries and working with private schooling. Huh? Claire, the floor is yours. Huh?
Thank you. Alors, merci beaucoup. Je vais faire mon intervention en français, par souci d'équité, puisque c'est le sujet. Merci beaucoup, Priya, pour cette riche intervention. Merci, Michaela, pour nous avoir réunis aujourd'hui sur ce débat. Donc, mon intervention en tant que discutant n'est pas celle d'un chercheur, comme Michaela l'a souligné, et ce n'est pas du point de vue de la recherche que j'ai lu et que je commenterai le travail de Priya, de Madame Joshi. Mon regard est celui d'un partenaire des pays en développement qui s'efforce d'accompagner et de soutenir le plus efficacement possible des politiques publiques en éducation. Et je crois que c'est d'ailleurs l'intérêt, comme vous le soulignez, d'avoir réuni ici à la fois l'opérationnel et la recherche. Disant cela, je vais essayer, au cours de mon intervention, de vous proposer quelques pistes de réflexion par rapport aux travaux de Madame Joshi, que je souhaite nous pourrons débattre par la suite. Comme Michaela le soulignait, je crois que l'angle d'attaque qui a été retenu par Madame Joshi est très singulier et original. Cette mise en lumière finalement des représentations du personnel éducatif, des écoles publiques et des parents d'élèves sur les écoles privées. Ici, la concurrence publique-privée est interrogée à l'aune des représentations et de la subjectivité des acteurs. Et son analyse est centrée sur l'attractivité des écoles et cette subjectivité de la demande sociale qui finalement n'est pas toujours objective ni scientifique. Voilà, c'est simplement en guise d'introduction un marqueur, je pense, à souligner dans cette étude et un point de départ qui peut permettre de nourrir effectivement un gap de recherche dans le domaine. Alors, j'ai oublié de dire que l'AFD n'intervient pas dans le secteur de l'éducation au Népal, mais dans bien d'autres pays. Donc, mon intervention va plutôt essayer de faire des parallèles avec d'autres pays qu'on connaît un petit peu mieux. Et ce qui, en comparaison de nos autres pays d'intervention, ce qui paraît particulièrement intéressant au Népal, c'est finalement cette politique publique qui est faiblement injonctive et directive, mais pourtant relativement claire dans ce principe. L'évolution de la politique éducative au Népal est le fruit d'une situation politique complexe. Aujourd'hui, elle donne de faibles injonctions aux écoles publiques comme privées. Elle prône l'autonomie des établissements, la responsabilité des acteurs et le choix pour les familles comme pour les établissements à tous les niveaux. Choix des langues, choix de positionner un examen d'entrée au collège, choix de l'uniforme. Et c'est une politique qui s'inscrit clairement finalement dans une logique de New Public Management et d'un pilotage par les résultats, par la performance, qui est tout à fait particulier. Donc même si elle est peu injonctive, elle est finalement marquée, elle a un marqueur fort qui est centré sur le choix scolaire. Disant cela, je souhaiterais mettre en perspective l'expérience du Népal par rapport à d'autres pays. Un collègue de notre division recherche à l'AFD, Rohan Begle-Pierre, a mené un travail similaire sur la question du choix des parents en analysant le cas de l'enseignement secondaire à Madagascar, où le privé représente 41% des effectifs du secondaire, dans un contexte historique très particulier, très différent d'ailleurs de celui du Népal. En synthèse, il montre que le choix du collège public ou privé, laïque ou confessionnel à Madagascar est influencé par un certain nombre de facteurs, et en premier lieu par la religion, la religiosité des ménages, ce qui visiblement au Népal n'est pas le cas. Et d'autres facteurs qu'on retrouve d'ailleurs au Népal sur la proximité par rapport au foyer, le coût, le taux de réussite aux examens et la sélection à l'entrée du collège. Bon, à titre de comparaison, c'est des données qui me paraissent intéressantes de souligner. Et également de rappeler finalement que l'offre privée d'un pays à un temps donné résulte d'une succession d'apports propres à l'histoire de chaque pays et que le concept d'école privée recouvre une diversité de situations et des perceptions du coup très différentes d'une société à l'autre. Pour en venir proprement à l'étude de Madame Joshi, une question qui m'est venue à la lecture de ce document, c'est que face à cette politique du choix scolaire, on a envie de se questionner sur cette concurrence entre établissements, puisque leur autonomie et leur pilotage par la performance provoquent structurellement une compétition. Et cette concurrence est posée d'emblée dans votre analyse entre public versus privé. Mais n'existerait-il pas également une concurrence entre tous les établissements, y compris public versus public? Vous évoquez notamment la mise en place en 2008 d'un mécanisme de financement incitatif pour les écoles publiques basé sur le nombre d'élèves. Et ainsi, la capacité à attirer et à retenir des élèves n'est-elle pas donc une réaction de certains établissements à une concurrence finalement générale au sein du système? Et allant plus loin dans ce sens, on peut aussi se questionner sur quels moyens et quelles régulations de la répartition des moyens sont définis par la politique publique pour donner finalement aux acteurs autonomes et redevables les capacités de réaliser réellement les performances attendues. Ça aurait été intéressant d'analyser peut-être ces écarts et défaillances dans l'allocation des ressources au sein des différents établissements publics comme privés, justement entre territoires également, entre urbain et rural, pour mettre en évidence cette analyse. Donc ça, c'est une question, un premier point à proposer au débat. Dans un contexte de choix politique très important, est-ce que donc cette concurrence ne se joue pas entre tous les établissements, si tant est que tous les établissements aient la même capacité et soient confrontés à des contextes comparables. Par ailleurs, vous signalez au début de votre analyse, et puis à plusieurs moments dans votre démonstration, la question de la stratification sociale. Vous dites effectivement au Népal que l'augmentation de l'offre d'éducation privée a eu pour conséquence une lutte pour conserver une mixité sociale, et notamment pour maintenir la présence des élèves de classe moyenne dans l'ensemble des écoles. Et ceci est d'autant plus important que vous rappelez que le privé est devenu une forme de différenciateur social qui peut entraîner du coup la concentration des élèves défavorisés dans l'offre publique et un problème de stigmatisation à long terme. Et dans ce sens, une question est venue: quelle est du coup l'évolution de la sociologie des publics dans les différentes offres scolaires, publiques et privées? Et cette évolution va-t-elle dans le sens d'une ségrégation croissante des établissements? Et effectivement, enfin, l'une des questions qui, vous le rappelez, revient souvent par rapport au privé, et est-ce que le développement du privé suscite en effet un certain nombre d'inquiétudes sur l'accroissement possible des disparités, des inégalités éducatives et sur la capacité d'un brassage social au sein de la société. Une des données intéressantes que vous avez relevées est que 43% des établissements publics qui subissent objectivement peu de concurrence, qui ont peu d'écoles privées dans leur alentour, finalement se ressentent pourtant en concurrence avec le privé et prennent des mesures pour des mesures similaires au privé, la question de la langue internationale, l'uniforme, l'appui aux élèves. Et n'est-ce pas parce que ces écoles bénéficient encore d'une certaine mixité sociale qu'elles veulent conserver, qu'elles réagissent face à une concurrence qui n'est pas encore là? C'est un point d'analyse qui m'aurait paru intéressant de peut-être et qu'on peut débattre aujourd'hui, c'est effectivement dans quelle mesure cette question de la mixité sociale ou de la stratification sociale influence sur les représentations des acteurs de l'école et pousse à la réaction. Et ainsi, on se pose la question: est-ce que finalement l'attractivité du privé ne tient pas à sa capacité d'attirer des classes sociales favorisées parmi ses effectifs plutôt qu'à l'information sur une offre de meilleure qualité? Voilà, un deuxième point à poser au débat. Ce point fait le lien aussi avec la question de l'équité et l'égale distribution de la qualité au sein du système éducatif, qui paraît effectivement crucial. Le rôle des politiques dans un tel contexte de concurrence est essentiel pour favoriser un système équitable, résoudre des disparités dans le système et interroger la question de la mixité sociale au sein des établissements publics et privés pour éviter une stratification sociale trop forte de la société et en vue de renforcer la cohésion sociale plus largement. Vous les évoquez dans les recommandations aux politiques publiques. Et effectivement, une des questions à la lecture de votre analyse était est-ce qu'au niveau du pays, il n'y a vraiment pas de données, d'analyse des indicateurs sociaux? Quels sont les publics qu'accueillent chacune des écoles? N'existe-t-il pas des indicateurs qui mesurent cette ségrégation sociale des établissements entre régions? Et quel est le suivi qui est fait par les districts? Et d'une certaine manière, par la suite, quelle est aussi la redevabilité qui est demandée aux établissements privés sur cette question de la mixité sociale? Il y a là un enjeu de régulation, il me semble, fort pour les politiques éducatives népalaises, de demander des comptes aux établissements privés sur cette question. On a l'exemple de l'Inde qui a mis en place des mesures incitatives où 25% des places des écoles doivent être réservées aux enfants des groupes défavorisés. On a également l'exemple de Madagascar où les subventions de l'État au privé visent à inciter les écoles privées à accueillir des enfants de milieux modestes. Voilà, donc ça, il me semble que le rôle de régulateur du gouvernement, afin de préserver l'équité au sein du système et les mesures incitatives qui peuvent être mises pour préserver cette mixité sociale sont essentielles. Et dans ce sens, un autre point qui questionne à la lecture est la question de l'impact sur la qualité des apprentissages. Sur les mesures prises par le public en réaction à la concurrence du privé, on peut se questionner sur l'amélioration. D'une part, vous l'avez signalé pendant votre présentation, sur les modalités de mise en œuvre des différentes mesures, sur la question notamment de l'anglais comme médium d'enseignement. Vous signaliez d'ailleurs que certaines écoles sont passées assez rapidement à l'anglais comme médium d'enseignement en réaction, puis sont revenues au népalais face aux difficultés d'enseignement dans cette langue. Donc cette question des modalités de mise en œuvre et de quelles réalités concrètes ces mesures se sont produites dans les écoles paraît essentiel, et par la suite leur impact en termes de qualité des apprentissages. De cette manière, il s'agirait de voir si cette concurrence finalement est bénéfique pour le système, un effet bénéfique pour le système. Y a-t-il eu une amélioration globale des acquis des élèves? Est-ce que le système a perdu ou gagné en termes d'équité? L'AFD avait conduit à ce sujet une étude sur les écoles privées qui analysait les pratiques des écoles privées, en quoi elles pouvaient être des facteurs de réussite, en mettant de côté le facteur socio-économique, et dans quelle mesure elles pouvaient être reproduites dans le public. Parmi les facteurs de réussite qui paraissaient les plus significatifs, il y avait la question de l'implication des parents qui attendent une redevabilité de l'école plus importante dans le privé que dans le public. Il y avait la question des innovations pédagogiques qui sont très fortes qui ont tendance à être très, très fortes dans le privé et moins dans le public. Ça, c'est un des éléments également que je souhaitais vous poser comme question sur ces questions d'innovation pédagogique. Est-ce que vous aviez vu des données intéressantes à ce sujet? Et le troisième facteur était une gestion de l'établissement plus efficiente et un contrôle plus fort des enseignants. Dans le cas du Népal, l'analyse de l'évolution des performances des élèves et l'analyse de la concurrence au regard de l'évolution de la qualité des apprentissages des élèves pourraient en ce sens éclairer les politiques publiques. En effet, on connaît le cas de certains pays, comme je pense au Congo-Brazzaville, qui a connu une forte augmentation de l'offre privée sans aucun contrôle de l'État, qui coûtait bien plus cher aux familles et qui n'a apporté pas de meilleurs résultats en termes sur le plan scolaire, d'après une étude du PASEC. Et pour revenir, un dernier point, pour revenir à la question de la mixité sociale, on peut également se poser la question de la qualité des apprentissages par rapport à la tendance à la stratification sociale de l'école. De nombreuses études ont montré que le maintien d'une hétérogénéité sociale au sein des établissements favorise une distribution de la qualité plus équitable dans le système. Et l'effet de composition, de mixité sociale de la classe a un lien significatif et positif sur les résultats scolaires, et notamment sur les performances des plus faibles, et surtout des classes sociales les moins favorisées, sans pour autant pénaliser les plus forts. Il y avait également, je crois, un point là-dessus dans l'analyse, dans le rapport PISA 2015 sur l'équité, qui montrait que les pays qui arrivent à réduire l'impact du statut socio-économique, réduire la ségrégation sociale entre écoles et à favoriser la mixité sociale dans les classes, n'obtiennent pas de moins bons résultats, voire ont des performances des élèves plus fortes. Et donc, un dernier point à proposer au débat, et donc celui-ci, quel impact cette évolution de la compétition privée-publique au Népal a-t-il eu sur la qualité des apprentissages, et cet impact est-il corrélé avec l'évolution de la mixité sociale dans le système? Voilà, pour terminer, les 4 pistes de débat que je vous propose. Voilà, je prends la parole. Merci beaucoup.
Merci Claire, c'est des commentaires très approfondis, très détaillés. Je pense que vous avez vraiment mis le point sur un certain nombre d'aspects qui sont très importants, comme l'accès à l'information, le rôle des politiques publiques, regarder vraiment les effets du secteur privé sur la qualité et l'équité, d'une manière systémique. Je pense que le problème était très bien posé. I would like to give the opportunity to Priya to respond perhaps to one of the questions that she would like to address, because if she responds to all of these questions, I think nobody else will be able to speak. So this is why I would like to divide it up this way. Perhaps you would, then we open up.
Yes, and thank you for your detailed comments, and we can definitely talk about it further. I think there's a simple issue of lack of data, which I think responds to some of your comments on, investigation of social diversity. It was one of the things I mentioned when I was talking about the lack of other data that needs to be there, because even to have a really concrete discussion on social diversity in the classroom, I basically had to make do with I basically collected all of my own data to answer the competition questions, but it just does not exist to that level. The other issue of learning outcomes, I have done analysis on competition and outcomes. The reason I don't discuss it as frequently is because it's just not as compelling as the rest of the discussion. But part of it is because the outcomes, the learning assessment data is just not there yet. And this research was done 5-6 years ago, where if you look at the test score outcomes, all you can say is that if you are a public school located in a high private market share economy area, you seem to be performing marginally better, but after you control for other characteristics, there's no significant association. But the public-private divide is much wider when you look at the high private market share areas, but that's probably because of, as something you mentioned, within private competition, the private schools are encouraged to perform as well as they can. There's so many questions here. I think a lot of them I can't answer because of data. On the question of isn't the attraction to private schools just about wealth and not about quality? I guess my perspective on this is it's a bit of both. You do have. I do think that there's a very strong thing coming out of my thinking and my analysis that so much of it is based on the social status issue that, but of course, once you're there, they are learning more, they are doing things differently. But again, this is not a very classroom-based analysis. So, a lot of your pedagogy questions or questions about exactly what are they learning are very difficult to answer. What's interesting is the private school principals, and, they're very frank about their limitations themselves. They talk about the things that they cannot provide. But I feel like it was quite superficial, our discussions on quality, primarily because they seem to have a romanticized version of, what I consider the best public school people. They kept saying things like the best performing public school students. Well, again, a very narrow set of people. They learn better because they learn by themselves, whereas we are so focused on preparing kids so they pass that high school exam. So that is, they show respect for the public system in terms of, all of the teachers that they had trained on. Because, we forget, again, this is a fairly young system. It's 60, 70 years old. So it's not that old. And, actually in some of the districts that are outside, some of these are, some of the older schools even, which have been around for at the most 20, 30 years, at the most. So you have this sort of idea that there is respect for the public system. There's a lot of talk about, mismanagement, which is, I think, is a very prevalent discussion in the literature. Public sector mismanagement, lack of control on teacher time, these sorts of things. The reason I don't fixate on those issues is because I was trying to tell a fairly concrete competition story, and also try to maybe add some new thoughts to the debate even on the politics side, because I think it's very well understood that those things are there even in a system like this. On your question about aren't they competing with within public and within private? I think it's a fair point. It's just that would require even more detailed analysis, which really is not possible here. But because I think the main distinction is between the two systems. Like, it's about the community. They actually think of themselves as two different systems. You have a private school association board that manages everything that's happening in private schools. I think even that which is one of the reasons I mentioned the communication point. They are quite active and engaged within each system. At least at the superficial level, but you really don't have much of that communication between. But it's a fair point, and I think there are some very good studies in the US where you have more definitions. You have more room to play with different definitions of competition. You have a lot more data because it's not being done by one person and their research project. It's basically state collected data to think about all these issues. So a lot of I would say that I tried to do what I could given the data I had at the end. So that is my answer to a lot of your questions. But I think there probably are a couple of other things that I probably should talk to you about, but maybe later.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Priya, trying to respond to these many questions, interesting questions. I would like to open the floor for other questions and perhaps comments, and please identify yourself. Yeah, we have Jim there and gentleman, and then Serge as well. Perhaps sorry. So perhaps we start from the back. Yeah, maybe more democratic.
Merci, Brice Aïda. Je suis enseignant. J'ai exercé dans l'enseignement supérieur marocain. J'exerce actuellement dans l'enseignement supérieur public français. J'aurais souhaité savoir si vous avez prêté attention aux études sur les politiques publiques ayant conduit à désintégrer, paupériser, discréditer le secteur public. Sans perdre de vue, bien évidemment, le poids de la corruption, de la classe politique, peut-être népalaise, je n'ai pas d'informations là-dessus, mais ceci peut avoir justement un impact sur l'absence d'une vision prospective, sur le rôle de l'école et de la cohésion sociale. Donc, ça me semble essentiel. Deuxième interrogation porte sur le poids du secteur privé par rapport au secteur public, les résultats et l'origine des fonds du secteur privé. en termes de financement, parce que si j'en avais parlé la dernière fois par rapport à mon pays, le Maroc, on sait qu'il y a de plus en plus d'écoles internationales, d'universités internationales qui s'implantent, bien évidemment au détriment du secteur public. Alors, dernier point, c'est sur justement les origines sociales, mais il me semble, vous l'aviez dit en concluant, les origines sociales des élèves qui fréquentent le secteur privé, l'étude comparative en termes de réussite, en termes d'insertion professionnelle, l'accès aux hautes fonctions publiques et privées, et l'impact de tout cela sur une éventuelle fracture sociale. Merci.
Merci, Serge Piano. Merci beaucoup d'abord pour toutes ces informations et toutes facilitent qui aident à bien réfléchir et à bien voir et observer tout un tas de choses sur ces questions qui sont évidemment que chacun regarde avec son propre prisme idéologique, parce qu'on est dans une discussion où effectivement chacun a sa perception. Et en matière de perception, il y a des choses, moi je vois très bien et je comprends très bien. J'étais un peu surpris par le titre général d'abord au début, parce que c'était les effets du privé sur le secteur public. Alors que, d'une certaine façon, et dans votre présentation, c'est plutôt la mauvaise situation de l'enseignement public et des écoles publiques qui crée finalement qui crée une demande et le développement d'un secteur privé. Moi, je le vois un petit peu comme ça. Je voudrais bien avoir votre avis sur ça, mais parce que les moteurs, finalement, de développement du privé, et pas uniquement au départ, dans beaucoup de pays, c'est la mauvaise qualité de l'enseignement public, essentiellement due à la massification, aux restrictions budgétaires, donc tout un ensemble, et aussi une démographie très forte, ce qui n'est pas le cas au Népal. Mais d'un autre côté, on a aussi un phénomène qui est là, dont vous avez bien mis, je pense, qui est important, et qui est l'émergence des classes moyennes urbaines. Donc des classes moyennes urbaines qui, elles, ont un désir de distinction sociale, et qui sont aussi engagées dans une compétition, et ce n'est pas la compétition des établissements scolaires, c'est la compétition des classes moyennes entre elles pour l'accès aux positions sociales et pour leurs enfants, dans la bataille pour leurs enfants, pour qu'ils accèdent à des conditions sociales meilleures. Et je pense que le fait, pour moi, je voudrais avoir votre opinion, mais c'est le choix de l'anglais comme langue d'enseignement et cette priorité qui est donnée est très liée pour moi à cette compétition sociale qui existe dans les classes moyennes. Alors, tout ça m'amène à quelque chose qui est, on parle de qualité, mais est-ce que finalement la qualité de l'éducation, la qualité de l'enseignement ou la qualité d'une école, on va dire qualité d'une école du point de vue de la famille, et je pense que, est-ce que vous seriez d'accord pour dire que les familles, finalement, une école de qualité, c'est une école où les enfants sont bien sélectionnés, viennent d'un milieu social même un peu supérieur au sien, donc à son propre milieu social, dans lequel il y a de la discipline, et finalement les résultats scolaires, on les met en avant, mais ça vient presque tout seul dans le résultat. Et puis, et là, on est et je pense qu'il y a un décalage entre le concept de qualité pour les familles, du point de vue des familles, du point de vue des enseignants dans les écoles et du point de vue des planificateurs et des responsables du système scolaire qui peut-être, comme vous le soulignez, n'ont pas suffisamment de connaissances, d'analyse, de réflexion sur vraiment quelles sont les motivations profondes des parents dans la demande pour le choix de l'école, parce que cette demande pour le choix de l'école, c'est aussi le résultat de ces évolutions sociales. Il y a un point, mon second point, c'est un point que vous avez aborder, mais un peu, j'aimerais avoir un peu plus d'informations, c'est sur la segmentation du marché des écoles privées. On sait que tout marché, finalement, va se segmenter et qu'il y a, vous avez montré les frais de scolarité selon les différentes catégories d'écoles privées. Mais derrière, les frais de scolarité, ce n'est pas uniquement un problème économique, c'est un problème social. C'est-à-dire que finalement, chacun va trouver sa place dans l'offre, où l'offre va s'adapter aux différentes demandes, et chacun va trouver sa place, avec une fragmentation, une segmentation. Donc, je voudrais avoir un petit peu comment, si vous avez pu observer, si vous avez des réflexions particulières sur ce domaine-là, et sur quelque chose qui me semble que finalement, on dessine une évolution au Népal qu'on peut retrouver par exemple en Amérique latine, où l'école publique devient une école pour les pauvres et pour les familles rurales. Et puis, après, les familles de la classe moyenne urbaine trouvent son chemin dans une offre qui est. Et je voulais savoir si, finalement, pour vous, je ne vous ai pas senti très optimiste sur. Donc, je voulais savoir un petit peu votre opinion, mais votre conclusion ne me semble pas très optimiste. Alors, je voudrais savoir, est-ce qu'au Népal, vous sentez qu'il y a un soutien et une possibilité d'avoir une forme d'école pour tous? Ou est-ce que la bataille est déjà perdue?
Jim, would you like to add?
Yeah.
Then you should respond to the three. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, three. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Jim Ackers from IIEP. Yeah, I think probably my comments will probably reflect what has already been said, but when you look back at the title of the presentation and how does private schooling affect the public system and educational equity, I don't think, I mean, I felt that really the equity component came as almost like a bit of a footnote at the end, and the analysis was largely around whether people, the middle class or the lower middle classes were satisfied with this system of choice, and therefore the conclusion came out as quite a positive conclusion. But having been in some of these big forums recently about the Sustainable Development Goals and all the emphasis in the SDGs on social inclusion, surely this the system that is developing is a very worrying system. And it seems like you didn't actually, one thing which would have helped a little bit as well is when you talked about schools would be to define the level of the school, because certainly linguists would agree that children starting to study in a foreign language in early childhood development centres or pre-primary or even lower primary, that has a negative impact on their acquisition even of the dominant language and then foreign languages later. So it's actually a bad practice. So what we're seeing is that private sector, because it's driving things through parents thinking they're going to have more opportunity for their children, is therefore being mirrored back in the public system. So for me, I was a bit surprised by, in a sense, how positive the final conclusion was. And I think the big question is, you know, what is the net impact of this all? And I know it's difficult, like you're saying, to measure because it's not, I don't think Nepal is part of a regional learning assessment system or anything like that. But what is the impact on the range of learning outcomes and average learning outcomes, etc. But also, what is the impact on social cohesion, which is such an important thing today?
So, yes, please.
I guess I will take 2 minutes to respond to all this.
2.5. Huh?
2.5. Yes, it's interesting, you know, because I feel like the question of whether it is a too positive or a too negative view of the society. I mean, it's very much in between. I don't have much of a I was trained as an economist. I approach this very much as we're talking about ideological perspective. I came at it as an economist. Does it actually make a difference? And by the time you're in the field and thinking about all this, the economists, the econ-friendly or the econ-focused arguments don't seem as relevant anymore. So I feel like both of you have noticed a very important, I think an important point. Like it started very much as the public-private debate, but it ended up becoming much more about the system. So it is an evolution in the research process, I guess, that led to all that. I think on this issue of on the social status, that better it has nothing. One of the points you had mentioned was the urban middle class are looking for better social status, and schools have. It's not really about schooling or the education per se issue. I mean, I guess it's the struggle we face that education is. It can be a social stratifier, or it can be a social equalizer. It is, in economics we call it either. It's a signal. There's a signaling effect. You are signaling something, or you are, or you have the other aspirational, goal of education. I mean, it is, I guess, the reason a lot of us are in education. But education fulfills both purposes, and you see in this data that it is fulfilling both purposes for a lot of people. It's because so much of this data that I have is based on, people from the field, I guess, the principals, the teachers, the local officials. I mean, it's not a science, again, not very easy to do a scientific analysis on this, but you find a wide range of thinking on, was it because of sorting? Was it because, was the parent demand because they want to sort their students, or is it because they have better quality? Everyone has a different take on it. It needs better data to do like a real analysis. I mean, there's some fairly innovative studies on other contexts where you can get a bit more at this question because you have better data. Again, going back to Chile, you have some very interesting results where you can actually say that, hey, look, people are sorting by religion, by basically looking for people who look like them and not really by performance. So, but you need much better data to be able to do that sort of analysis. What was interesting is that the private school parents said that they were definitely not sorting by. So there were questions in the survey about, is it about social status? So the private school parents said half of them were like, of course not, and public school parents were, of course it is about social status. So that I guess gives the answer to most of us. And as you point out, I think it's a very, for me, it is very much about equity because I'm surprised that you think that it's not adequately about equity. It is about a very highly segmented market. It is about people sort of ending up in situations where there's absolutely no choice, absolutely no recourse to action, absolutely, and very, very poor quality education. A lot of this is about implications for equity. I feel like all of the results sort of point to that. And yes, I don't think, like, even though I like the data, I feel like it's quite an intuitive. One of the things that Claire had mentioned earlier was it's a perception-based analysis and not scientific, and not quite scientific. One of the reasons, Kahneman, I think, won a Nobel Prize for this. It's most people make decisions based on heuristics, shortcuts. The question of a huge focus on, well, it's one of the questions that it's one of the things about why in Chitwan parents are willing to go and monitor schools. How much, if you are overwhelmed by 50 or 60 choices, will you really go and make, will you really investigate all of those 50 or 60 choices? You will use information that you trust. You will use your informal networks. You will use, so you will assess it by your ability to pay. You will slot yourself where you think you can belong. And again, so much of it depends on, I guess, social segregation, housing segregation, all of these things. It is happening in the society. So, so yes, it is a highly segregated education system because again, there have been efforts to, of course, expand the system. Many significant efforts. There has been financing improvements in the system. Lots of scholarships for disadvantaged communities. But all of it is geared towards the public system. The private system, I think someone had asked about how are the private schools funded? private schools are, I mean, it's a very simple system to this day anyway, that there are no, the government does not fund private schools, they just allow them to exist. So they have regulations about how many private, there are regulations about, you know, what kinds of private schools can exist, you know, based on density of schools sort of measures. But, you know, there are loopholes. So the reason there's too many private schools in some areas is because there are loopholes. You can circumvent the system fairly easily, even though they are written regulations. I might not be getting at all of these things. I think there are a couple of questions about what about the long-term implications. There just isn't that kind of data for the Nepal context about, you know, labor market implications and the impact on the social divide. It's clearly the case, you know. I mean, we just had a major revolution based on, you know, the fact that a huge portion of the population was marginalized. So, and there are, you know, critics, and there are people who are much more focused on these, on the conflict, you know, the conflict dimension of Nepal, who are talking about these issues and the underappreciation of the social cohesion dimension in recovery efforts, you know, especially after the conflict, you know, and there's some attention to peace education, but not enough, you know. So you have these, I think a lot of the criticism at this stage on the social cohesion and the curriculum level is that there's just not enough attention. But yes, I guess I can't speak to all of that, but that's my feeling. On the question, sorry, one more point I'll make. Whether I'm not very optimistic, and can there be a school for all? One thing I mentioned there was when you have sort of like a medium-sized district where there's medium market share, and when you have you know, a strong like Chitwan and a couple of other districts like this, if the community, if there are sort of, you know, motivated principals, there were a couple of instances where people did try to change things, and the community said yes, you know, we would prefer to go to public school. So you do have, I think, a situation where if it's just sort of stratified but not really stigmatized, I think it is possible to have a school for all. Because, you know, how many schools does a community need? I mean, in the end. So, but I do think in certain situations it is far gone. It is really far gone. The number one, the sort of the most historic public school in Kathmandu, the first public school in Kathmandu. My grandfather studied there. I only stepped foot in it because of this study. It's, you know, 10 minutes away from where I grew up. So that is the situation, and it has very few students, and most of the students are people who the parents basically sell local goods, I guess, in the neighborhood. So, you know, the parents can go work and the students can go to school. So segmentation is the story of the market. It is the reason I don't focus on these outcome analyses anymore. The story is about segmentation. And yes, I think the government is trying to do some things. You see those, like I mentioned, the scholarship interventions are actually quite important, and Nepal is a pretty important study for case for that. But it's hard, you know. And you mentioned the mother tongue of instruction issue. It is, you know, yes. It's interesting because Nepal has adopted mother tongue instruction policies, and one of the local officials basically said, you have this, you have the possibility for Nepal Bhasa, which is my mother tongue, in some of these public schools, but all of the students are not of that language anymore because they've all, you know, they don't really, they've all gone to private school, so that school is full of people who speak another language at home. So you have these policies. So I feel like there are policy attempts. I don't know if it's not acknowledging exactly what the private is doing to the public has led to lags. I would say, you know, you'll find that there's been a lot of ineffectiveness due to not appreciating all parts of your system. And the private is a huge system, especially in the big urban centers of the country, and I actually even, you know, even in some of the rural areas. So and actually, even though the numbers are not significant in rural areas yet, we know from, you know, globally that there are underestimates in many parts of the world. Private schooling is quite significant, especially I think near the Indian border. There's a lot of unregistered schools. So yes, I mean, it's a smattering of comments, but I have some optimism, but I think not a lot.
Okay, it's a good thing to remain optimistic for sure. Do we have any other questions? Otherwise, we have also some questions from those who follow us on streaming. There's a question here about which countries could be a model in terms of integrating public and private schools within the education sector. I think the emphasis is here on integration. That's also a question to Claire, who has worked in a number of countries. We have another question. You may think about it in the meantime. Locally grown solutions are important, you said. What evidence do you have on that? But perhaps we will ask Claire about what examples she can give of countries that have managed to integrate well the public and the private sector in education.
Je pense qu'il est difficile de donner des exemples de pays. On peut donner des exemples de pays qui ont mis en place des mesures incitatives pour favoriser la mixité sociale dans le privé, pour encourager pour mettre en place des conventionnements et une forme d'assurance qualité pour les établissements privés. Peut-être Serge Peano dans la salle aura aussi des idées, puisqu'il a conduit pour l'AFD une analyse un peu comparative des expériences des différents pays. Mais c'est un défi, je pense, qui est important de relever. Et, bonne question.
Bonne question pour les politiques publiques. Hein. Serge, est-ce que tu veux en dire quelque chose sur les bonnes pratiques?
Non, c'est le mot intégration qui fait que les pays où il y a une bonne intégration, c'est-à-dire finalement on va les trouver dans certains pays européens dans lesquels il y a historiquement une implication d'écoles essentiellement de nature religieuse, privée, financée par l'État, et où il y a une harmonie finalement d'une certaine façon entre les structures. Mais dans les pays du Sud, clairement, je ne vois pas, je ne peux pas dire qu'il y a un pays où il y a une bonne intégration. Mon sentiment est plutôt que le privé se développe, mais que le gros problème, c'est la détérioration, le mauvais état des systèmes publics. C'est à mon sens le gros problème en termes politiques. Alors après, face à ces situations, face aux demandes des familles, parce qu'il y a une demande croissante des classes moyennes urbaines qui demandent à avoir le choix, qui demandent à avoir le droit d'éviter un système public pas performant et qui comptent sur le plan politique, et même les cadres de l'administration font partie de cette classe moyenne, donc sont parfaitement conscients des difficultés. Donc il y a dans ces cadres-là à trouver dans chacun des pays, en fonction des situations, des aménagements. Je ne dirais pas une intégration, des aménagements de la situation.
Merci. On a une prise de parole là, au fond de la salle.
Oui, j'ai posé la question tout à l'heure sur l'insertion professionnelle et je voudrais savoir, comparativement à la référence que je cite souvent de nos pays d'origine, on a tendance à voir que ces écoles forment des générations de chômeurs. Donc, il y a un taux de chômage énorme. Et puis, ceux qui arrivent à s'en sortir, finalement, ils trouvent des emplois ici en France ou à l'étranger. Donc, finalement, ces systèmes éducatifs des pays dits en voie de développement deviennent justement de véritables pourvoyeurs de main-d'œuvre qualifiée pour les pays développés. Et donc, ça accentue encore les dissensions entre pays dits riches et pays dits pauvres. Donc, est-ce que vous avez pris en considération fracture mondiale. Voilà, parce qu'on a tendance à privatiser de plus en plus l'enseignement primaire, secondaire et même supérieur. Et pour quelles conséquences à long terme? Merci.
Just say something about this. About access to the labor market and migration. It's a broad debate. Huh?
Yeah, I think the first. Sorry, I was going to respond to that first question on the models for integration. I think it's correct. I think it's correct that it's very hard to do when everything else is sort of in shambles. You know, it happens when you have better management, things can improve. It is the reason I made that point that, and I've made it for other issues as well, that if you are considering public-private partnerships, which, you know, many countries are, you need very strong, robust government commitment. Easier said than done, because, you know, if there was robust, strong government commitment, government capacity, etc., then the public system would not be in the state it is. So I feel like I think I hold on to this idea that the idealized situation, given that education is a public good, is that you know, we should not have a private system. Given that that has not been the case, you know, what are your suboptimal, you know, best case, you know, second best sort of situations, you know, that may exist. And I don't know about that. So I feel like it is very much linked to, you know, the levels of development, etc. But, you know, even like the reason I mentioned Chile or the US or other countries that have tried all this is that you find the equity consequences even there. You find it in New Zealand when they tried a dezoning policy that, you know, improved choice. So you have situations. It is sort of a global storyline, this equity point, that is not just about the poorest countries and the lowest capacity. I mean, I think there's probably a lot to be said about, you know, so many types of private engagement. You know, they can be in supporting roles, like, for instance, there are, you know, private contractors that provide food, and, you know, you have all these other sorts of engagements that also exist. So there's probably a lot of debate that can be had on that as well. The question about locally grown solutions, I don't have, let's say, you know, a dramatic answer for that. But I did present, I think, what I thought were the right anecdotes of, you know, of schools where over 20 years, you know, schools, especially one of those schools that I call School B, you know, he gave me basically a chart of what they had done. You know, 20 years ago, they were not doing so well. Then they did X and Y and Z, and that's how they improved. He was then invited by other public schools to come speak, other public schools to come help manage, to help, you know, guide their management strategy when they try to transform. You know, X number of years later, those schools also improved their, you know, performance. It's these sorts of, I think, you know, we talk about management, like especially at this sort of macro level, we talk about governance and management a lot, but a lot of these are sort of lessons that have to be learned on the ground. That's all I meant by the locally grown solutions, that they don't have to, especially in the context of things like, you know, private change that exist in developed countries and are, you know, hoping to make a profit by providing education in poorer countries. And there, I think there were several examples that I gave that sort of speak to this idea that local energies, there are lots of local energies that are working to provide good education to the system. In fact, one of the things I would want to say is I started off thinking that I would find very much this a very big story of despair in the public system. What I found was the heterogeneity of the public system and tremendous energy and tremendous good work being done in the public system. So, you know, someone had asked whether I was optimistic at all. Again, yeah, I feel like there's a lot of good energy. Locally grown solutions, it simply means, you know, there are things happening locally. Use them to whatever degree you can. Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question on the long-term implications of migrant labor. Is it that all of the school system is preparing people to leave the country? Was it that?
About the linkage between, if I understood the question well, it was about the linkage between education and public-private education and prospects for entry into the labor market.
Yeah.
And then the consequences that this may have on migration.
Yeah.
then maybe since you're working on primary schools, that was not such a relevant dimension.
I was actually working on secondary level. This is all secondary level, but they go from 1st to 10th grade. The main issue, I guess, is it is a remittance dependent economy. The big one of the big problems has been the lack of employment, lack of strong growth in employment. So the remittance dependence comes from people graduating, to some degree. I think at least the 10th grade, the SLC exams, and a manpower agency, as they call them, sending them off to the Middle East and to Asia. So that is the sort of development model of Nepal, through all the conflicts and the earthquake. I mean, the reason it is sustained was because it was dependent on remittances. Most of, I think, the GDP growth you see in the country is based on remittances. The question of what does it do to a country in the long term? I mean, devastating consequences, of course. When you talk to the most, the intellectual, well, not the intellectual, but the elites of the elders of these communities, you hear about the real loss of young people, vibrant people who can be pillars of the community, who learn about who are there to solve the needs of the local community. So the long-term needs are quite devastating. I think there's actually even getting to be a labor shortage, agricultural labor shortage in Nepal, because of the lack of because everyone's abroad, so and you have to import labor. So yeah, I mean, there are many consequences of this, especially in terms of national development and I think it's correctly pointed out that it really affects the inequality between high income and low income countries, especially with and the brain drain stuff is actually quite interesting. But I think it's really interesting in the health sector. If you look at all of the health professionals who have basically been educated in country X and then have been shipped off, or then are shipped off to other countries from the Caribbean, from many other destinations. There is there are real implications of this for equity, and the fact that there isn't global movements to equalize this somehow from a financing point of view or a personnel point of view is quite. I think there's a lot to be done there.
Thank you very much. I think we are coming to the end of our strategic debate. Thank you very much for listening and for participating, asking questions, making comments. I would like, of course, to thank very cordially our two speakers, Priya Joshi and Claire Galante, for their interventions. I think it's a question that the question of private schooling and its impact on public schooling, and the question of private schooling and its broader impact on the social system. I think these are questions that will remain with us, and it will evolve. And I think the local context is also very important. I think that was a point that Claire made very prominently, that really the way that the equation solves really very much depends on the local context. I think we had quite some discussion about public policy and how the government should react to that, and I think that's of course the perspective that we approach the issue here at our institute, since we are a governmental organization, and we like to make policy recommendations also to those who are framing regulation policies for the private sector. And I think that has been very, very interesting to hear you on how you see how the regulatory frameworks for private education could evolve. Now, I think we should give a final clap to our speakers. And I would like to invite you to the cocktail that we have. And if you have more questions to Claire and to Priya, this is an opportunity to discuss with them. Thank you very much.